The days of the small town anxiously awaiting the arrival of the train, an old locomotive bringing loved ones, visitors, and heroes home, are long gone. But in the 21st century, America's railroads are still the most vital piece of the nation's transportation network. A network carrying over 42% of America's freight, delivering the 1.5 trillion ton miles of goods more efficiently than any other railroad system in the world. Indeed, delivering more goods than the rest of the world combined. It is an efficiency that provides the United States with a huge competitive advantage in the global economy. Freight trains have gotten larger, locomotives more powerful. No longer carrying just commodities, they have become containerized. While coal is still the single major item moved by trains, 44% of modular shipments, including semi-truck trailers, have tripled in the last 20 years. What has shrunk is the number of Class 1 railroads. Major interstate rail lines have declined from over 130 in the 1930s to a mere 7 today. The Burlington Northern, the Canadian National, Canadian Pacific, Consolidated Rail Corporation, CSX Corporation, the Kansas City Southern, Norfolk Southern, and the Union Pacific. These 7, plus Amtrak, the sole rail line in America devoted to passenger travel that is now centered on commuter trains and light rail, carrying people from place to place within giant metro complexes. Metro complexes that 180 years ago were connected by canals, rivers, and oceans, or had yet to spring up on the map. 180 years ago, in the 1830s, that's when railroading started in America. In 1827, it was a lofty goal: build a railroad between Baltimore, Maryland, and the new state of Ohio. Particularly lofty since no one at that time had built any railroads at all in America. But that was the kind of entrepreneurial vision that was driving the up-and-coming United States of America.
Well, the B&O, right place, right time, right amount of money, right number of people in the right place doing the right thing, and they got started. And they're the first ones, the B&O Railroad was the first one to get going.
The story of the Baltimore and Ohio is the story of America in the early 19th century. A smart meritocracy, always looking for a new way to grow and become great. In 1827, the city fathers of Baltimore, Maryland, were troubled. The great cities along the nation's east coast were in a race to establish a link to the nation's heartland. It was the era of the canal. Man-made waterways that carried freight and people. It was the nation's first economic boom. And the granddaddy of all the canal schemes was the Erie Canal, celebrated in song and deed. It stretched from Albany, New York, on the Hudson River, to Buffalo on the shores of Lake Erie. Completed in 1825, it was an instant success. Now goods could travel from New York City to the west without ever having to go overland by foot or horse. In the minds of her city fathers, Baltimore was now all but irrelevant as a major seaport. Philip Evan Thomas, the father of American railways, and George Brown were not going to let that happen. Brown was an Irish-American investment banker, a financier par excellence. On February 12, 1827, he gathered together 24 of Maryland's leading merchants at his Baltimore home. Among them was Philip E. Thomas, a staunch supporter and advocate of Brown's ambitious plan of a railroad to make Baltimore competitive with other eastern seaboard ports. They were so persuasive that within days, stock was issued, and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad became the first U.S. railway chartered for commercial transport of passengers and freight. 1 year later, construction began. But the B&O still had to prove that a train could actually run on the track. Thomas was sure that the future of American railroading was the steam engine he had seen in England. Proof that it would work fell to inventor Peter Cooper and his little steam-powered locomotive named, appropriately, Tom Thumb. Designed and built in 1830, Cooper needed to convince owners of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad to use steam engines. As legend has it, an impromptu race with a horse-drawn car was set up as a demonstration. The tiny but powerful Tom Thumb jumped to an early lead. Then when victory seemed assured, a belt slipped off a pulley and the engine lost power. In spite of losing the race, the demonstration was deemed a success. The next year, with the railroad committed to the use of steam locomotion, American railroading was underway. The fantastic success of the Baltimore and Ohio spurred a frenzy of railroad building in the pre-Civil War years. In 10 years, the amount of track laid tripled what had been done in the previous 20 years. And yes, Baltimore and the Ohio River were connected by rail in 1852, when the original B&O line was completed to Wheeling, West Virginia. And by 1860, it reached the Queen of the West, Cincinnati, Ohio. And for a time, Baltimore was the second largest city in the nation. A city that welcomed the billowing smoke of the steam engine. There is nothing quite like it. The trembling ground underfoot. 1,000 horsepower of 60 tons of steel and iron hurtling 50 miles an hour straight at you. This terrible iron horse, spitting steam, smoke, and cinders into a calm blue sky. This beast was not only the symbol of America's rise to economic power, it was also the engine that created America's first billion-dollar industry. The first truly nationwide American industry from top to bottom. Americans could set their watches by the arrival of the steam locomotive. Inside the cramped cabin, the firebox blazes with red-hot coal. In front of the box, the boiler is hissing super hot water, hissing steam. Within the cab, a two-man crew. The engineer or driver controls the iron beast, stopping, starting, and speed. The fireman is responsible for the fire, fuel, coal or wood, steam pressure, and water levels. Water levels are maintained by a series of water supply towers along the tracks. All this power contained and mounted on the chassis and running gear of the locomotive.
Steam locomotives, such as this big behemoth from the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, are generally categorized by their wheel arrangement. For example, this locomotive is called a 484. Another word for the 484 is a northern type. Those numbers, 4, 8, and 4, The first number refers to the number of little wheels guiding the locomotive into a curve. Consequently, with a four-wheel such as this and this wheel down here, that's one truck, one wheel set, and two wheels on this side plus two more on the other makes the four wheels, guides this big monster weighing 317 tons into a curve very smoothly, so that we don't have any of those lateral jolts transmitted back through the length of the train. Moving back, the second number in that 484 is the number of driving wheels. Here is the second driving wheel, and you'll notice how tall it is. It's over 6 feet in diameter. So with this being 72 inches times 1.15, this locomotive could easily travel 90 to 100 miles an hour. The third number are the number of wheels supporting the firebox. This silvery colored box is the firebox, where the fire actually is built inside. And there are four wheels supporting the firebox on the back end. So this locomotive is a 484.
The largest steam locomotive ever built was the Union Pacific's Big Boy. Twice the size of this engine and weighing in at over 600 tons. The popular Parker Brothers board game Monopoly has a railroad in the middle of each side: the Pennsylvania, the Reading, the Short Line, and the B&O, named for America's most famous railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio. All, except for the Short Line, were named after great American railroads founded in the first big railroad boom from 1830 to 1860. The Short Line is a different story. There never was such a railroad. It was, and still is, a name for the hundreds, if not thousands, of small railroad companies that built short railroad lines, most only a few miles long.
Well, there's lots of short line railroads, some of them industrial and some of them just built into areas where the big railroads didn't go in, but they acted as feeders. Now, when you had a short line railroad that loaded cars on their line, and then they had to interchange to a larger railroad.
One of those larger railroads, the Pennsylvania Railroad, became the standard of excellence in American railroading well into the 20th century. Founded in 1846, the venerable Pennsylvania Railroad, sometimes referred to as the Pennsy, has been heralded as the standard railroad of the world. The fourth railroad on the Monopoly board is the Reading. Take a ride on the Reading. If you pass go, collect $200, says one of the chance cards in the Monopoly game. The Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, later the Reading Company, is actually supposed to be pronounced Reading. It was originally chartered to build a line between Reading and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The original Reading Main Line extended south from the coal mining town of Pottsville to Reading and then onward to Philadelphia. Upon its completion in 1843, the line had the distinction of being the first double-track main line in the United States. It was a company that made huge profits by hauling coal from mines to cities, demonstrating another avenue for our railroads to make huge sums of money: the single-purpose rail line. The rail line designed to move one kind of resource, a practice copied many times over as the railroads moved into the mineral-rich West and the timber-rich Northwest. Not on the Monopoly board, the Erie Railroad was chartered in April 1832 to run from the banks of the Hudson River to the shores of Lake Erie, with the restriction that it could not enter any other state or connect with railroads from other states. A restriction which, in typical railroad arrogance, it ignored, dipping into Pennsylvania on the way to its final destination, Dunkirk, New York. At that moment, the Erie Railroad became the longest continuous railroad in the world. But the granddaddy of all the pre-Civil War Eastern Railroad lines was the New York Central Railroad. Known simply as the New York Central, the NYC was the brainchild of one of railroading's earliest risk-takers, Erastus Corning. Born in 1794, Corning was an iron merchant who quickly saw the potential of railroads to make money and invested heavily in New York State's many rail lines. But it was his groundbreaking idea of creating the New York Central that would change not only the nature of running the railroad business, but the nature of America's economy for good. By 1851, Corning realized that New York's mishmash of separately owned railroads was not only inefficient, it was unprofitable. At the same time, he also saw the market possibilities to make lots of money if the lines were merged into one corporation. So, just like George Brown, who 20 years earlier brought together investors to create the B&O Railroad, Corning gathered together presidents and owners from 8 of New York's small feeder lines. These lines serviced towns along the Erie Canal and the Hudson River and brought goods and passengers down to New York City. He convinced the owners that merging into a giant corporation would not only work better and more efficiently, it would make them millionaires. Everyone agreed, and 2 years later, the New York Central was born, with Corning as president. Almost overnight, Corning had created an economic powerhouse, the likes of which the nation had never seen before. The likes of which only the new and innovative railroad industry could create. The merger was a stunning feat with consequences that would ripple through the American economy for the next 150 years, because Corning did more than just form a corporation. He set a new standard for industrial growth. Made famous by Johnny Cash's song, Rock Island Line, Illinois' Rock Island and LaSalle Railroad Company was incorporated in 1847. The first train reached Rock Island in 1854, becoming the first railroad to connect Chicago with the Mississippi River. By 1860, the North and Midwest had constructed railroad networks that linked every major city. In the heavily settled Corn Belt, from Ohio to Iowa, over 80% of farms were within 5 miles of a railway. However, in the South, the story of railroads was radically different. Though the South had been an early leader in railway building, the region had concentrated on short lines, linking cotton regions to ocean and river ports. There was no network of rail lines connecting one part of the South with another. This lack of a network would become a major handicap during the American Civil War. With the Civil War over, 4 changes were about to propel railroading into becoming America's dominant industry in the second half of the 19th century. Transcontinental rail lines, Pullman cars, the rise of train depots as a major social institution, and air brakes.
The biggest thing on the railroads, technological-wise, was the air brake, devised by George Westinghouse. And before that time, trains had to be small because the brakemen had to go up on roofs and tighten down the brake handles, which would in turn tighten down the brakes on the car. And this was a very tedious process, a very dangerous process, especially in wintertime where the brakemen would literally fall off the cars. And so Westinghouse was able to make an air brake system that would allow the engineer to do all the braking.
George Westinghouse in the late 1800s, maybe on into the early 1900s, invented what was called the George Westinghouse air brake system, where the compressed air generated by the steam locomotive is transmitted down the entire length of the train by these so-called glad hands, things that couple together and allow the compressed air to pass from locomotive to car after car after car, all the way down the length of the train. The George Westinghouse air brake system works by applying air ahead of time, storing it in a reservoir, so the compressed air is actually used to hold the brakes off. And if you ever actually lose the air, the brakes automatically apply.
Today, train depots are a mere ghost of what they were in the 19th and early 20th century, the center of American life.
Well, the depot is a public place, and it's originally built as a sort of temporary stopping point, storage point, warehouse. But the people in the community won't allow that to stay a low-grade service building. People dress up to go to the train station to see the train come in. It's an event. It's a center of town. The main hotel is built across the street from the station. The main restaurants are located nearby. The telegraph office is located there, which provides the news service for the newspapers. Much of the business of the community is rooted through, as all of the shopkeepers get all of their supplies and whatnot from the freight office and the depot, and the passengers buy their tickets at the ticket office and use the train station. So the depot is a focal point of activity in town.
These great pieces of architecture, at least the ones still surviving, have been turned into museums, shops, and restaurants.
The railroads built the depots primarily for their own benefit, but in larger cities they have union depots in which several railroads combine, and the union depots tend to be much more grand and elaborate affairs, often connected with an office building, so it becomes, in a sense, the business center of town as well.
Moving soldiers around like cattle was okay during the Civil War. After all, General Sherman said, "War is hell." But during peacetime, and with the arrival of the Gilded Age, passengers wanted to travel in style. An American engineer and entrepreneur, George Pullman, had the answer: the Pullman car.
George Pullman, I suspect one of the things that brought him into railroad history and railroad culture was the fact that he was the one who sort of responsible for designing and engineering the replacement to lightweight passenger cars. Those cars were too individually built. George Pullman designed a car that could be operated over any of the hundreds of railroads that would operate in the United States. And anybody who wanted to could buy a Pullman car. George Pullman, to railroad cars, passenger cars, was kind of the equivalent of Henry Ford might be to the automobile.
With the arrival of the Pullman car, passengers could now travel, eat, and even sleep in comfort as they sped their way across the country. A country that was about to be united by transcontinental railroads. The dream of tying the Atlantic and Pacific coasts together with a transcontinental railroad was as old as the railroads themselves. But when gold was discovered in California in 1848, the whole country got gold fever, and it became an obsession. But it wasn't until the Civil War broke out that the dream became a reality. The Union wanted railroads to bring in Western gold, and with the passage of the Homestead Act in 1862, it became a national goal to use railroads to fill in the country from the Mississippi River west to the Pacific Ocean. But who could build such a railroad? It was a long way, over 1,700 miles through rugged country controlled by hostile Indians. Who could build an engineering marvel comparable to building the pyramids. The upstart Union Pacific and the established Central Pacific were chosen, but they were going to need some help. And the federal government took an unprecedented step of not only bonding a good part of the project, but also giving the railroads the land to build the track. This foresight is a little-known part of Abraham Lincoln's genius.
The Republican Party during the Civil War, Lincoln's party, was a modernizing, industrially oriented, financially oriented party that saw the future of America not so much in traditional old-fashioned agriculture, but in modern agriculture, modern industry, and modern cities that are going to be railroad-based. That meant opening up the farmlands of what is today Minnesota, the Dakotas, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Montana, opening up those farmlands. That can only be done with railroads.
Construction began in earnest after the Civil War, with the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroads in the race of the century to see who could build the most track. The Central Pacific went east out of Sacramento and almost immediately ran into the dangerous task of blasting a trail through the steep Sierra Nevada mountains. The work was so dangerous that whites weren't interested, so the Central Pacific had to find a different source of labor.
Now on the west end, the Central Pacific from Sacramento, they started out with Caucasians, but didn't work out too well, so they found that they could bring Chinese in. They used Orientals to build that railroad.
Going west from Omaha, the Union Pacific ran into blistering, cold prairie winters and Indian raids.
The Indians weren't very happy. They didn't like people invading their territory. It was taking away some of their hunting grounds. The Indians caused a lot of trouble. Like one example at a place called Plum Creek in Nebraska, that's now Lexington. The Indians wrecked a train and killed a lot of people, and they had military along with them all the time to try to take care of the Indian situation, but sometimes it got out of hand. Right east of Cheyenne here, there was a surveyor that was killed, and the town of Hillsdale's named after him. But the Indian problem occurred all along, especially in Nebraska, and until they reached about central Wyoming, it let up.
The accomplishment of the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific was a heroic achievement, with the Union Pacific winning the race, putting down 1,087 miles of track to the Central Pacific's 690. On May 10, 1869, the two railroads met at Promontory Summit, north of Ogden, Utah. The celebration rocked the nation. A journey that had taken 6 months by wagon train now took 1 week. It was the equivalent of the 20th century sending a man to the moon. And it kicked off a second boom in railroad building and the age of the railroad tycoons. Americans would coin a new word for these railroad tycoons. They would call them the robber barons. By 1893, there would be 4 new transcontinental rail lines, 2 flanking each side of the first one. To the north, Jay Cook's Northern Pacific connected Duluth, Minnesota, with Tacoma, Washington. Begun in 1870, Tacoma wasn't reached until 1888. J.J. Hill's Great Northern Railway, started in 1879, spanned the northern tier of states from Minneapolis, Minnesota to Seattle, Washington, laying the last rail in 1893. To the south, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway started construction in 1859 in Topeka, Kansas, and reached San Diego, California 27 years later. while Leland Stanford's Southern Pacific, connecting California with New Orleans, began laying track in 1865 and was completed in 1883. These great transcontinental railroads were built by the leading industrialists of the age, men who rode the wave of the second railroad building boom. And by taking advantage of the federal government's generous land grant and loan policies, became instant millionaires. As a result, they earned the very fitting nickname, the Robber Barons. As the 20th century dawned, the heyday of railroad's second building boom was ending. A vast network of rail lines tied the nation together. The height of railroad trackage was in the second decade of the 20th century. It was also the time when the federal government took over the railroads after America's entry into the First World War. With the end of that war and the rise of the automobile and trucks, the railroads began to decline. Less track, fewer cars and locomotives. Then came the era of the diesel engines, and railroading was never the same again.
The various yards and shops all over the country started shutting down because diesels could operate much farther. They didn't have to have all this water. Coal bins weren't needed. So diesels really changed the way the railroads thought and worked. Instead of having hundreds of shopmen, you only needed a few. You didn't need big facilities. And railroads sold off a lot of property, got rid of it because they just didn't need it. Diesels don't have to go 100 miles and rewater and all that. Now they can go thousands of miles and get refueled. And so diesels changed the way the railroad worked.
Today, the locomotives of 150 years ago now rest in graveyards around America, reminders of an era in American history when these mighty and proud engines were the workhorses of America's Industrial Revolution, when they were the nation's symbols of achievement, of strength, and of the country's unique can-do spirit that is still strong in the 21st century.